Good morning and happy Friday. My name is Phyllis Newbill. I'm one of the associate directors in one of several centers within ICAT. So glad you all are here this morning. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. As always, we are live streaming the ICAT Playdate, and it will exist on the internet afterwards, so behave accordingly. Also, be sure to enjoy some pastries and coffee and tea. We are able to provide pastries and coffee and tea because we have a sign-in sheet, so when the clipboard comes around, please do help us make sure that we continue to have pastries, because that's very important. If PDN credit or Professional Development Network credit is helpful to you as a Virginia Tech faculty member, just make sure that first you register for that PDN credit. You can use the QR code on the bottom of the clipboard, or you can sign in the way you usually do. And then also just make sure that you've made eye contact with me, and I give you your A+ for the day. When you have questions today, just wait for me to get to you with the microphone so that the folks online will be able to hear you. And if you're online, good morning. We're glad you're here as well. And when you have questions, just use that questions link, and we'll be monitoring that form during the questions period. In the way of announcements this morning, we have some things coming up. There's a talk in the Cube April 14th at 7 p.m. on from the World According to Sound is the group, and talking about ways of knowing in science. I can't wait for this one. And finally, ICAT Day is May 4th, so in the late afternoon on Monday, May 4th, we'll be sharing some seed grant projects, and I hope you'll come over to the Center for the Arts to see those. All right, I'm going to turn it over. I can't wait for this one. If you come to these religiously, you've seen me hand out flyers about this project, and so now we get to hear more about it and how it's gone. So I'm going to turn it over to John Catherwood again.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Phyllis. We really appreciate it. And good morning. How are you doing this morning? Good, good. Thank you so much for being here. My name is John Catherwood Ginn, and I'm an assistant professor of applied theater over in the School of Performing Arts, as well as serve as a co-director of research at the Center for Communicating Science. We're going to share the mic here.
Sure. Good morning. I'm Hoda. I work with the computer science department. I teach AI, so I'm responsible for teaching the future generation of AI practitioners, I guess. So that's why I'm here. And also, I direct the machine learning research lab. Thank you.
Thanks. Before we get started, of course, I wanted to take a moment to thank ICAT for not only the support of the project that we've been able to embark on this past semester, but the opportunity to speak with you all about it this morning. We're really eager to be able to share what we found so far and to hear from you what you're curious about and maybe opportunities for collaboration as well. I'd also like to take a moment to thank my colleagues in the School of Performing Arts. The facilities that we've used for these workshops have been provided by SOPA, which we're very grateful for. And of course, my excellent colleagues in the Center for Communicating Science. They've also been so supportive of this project from its design to implementation, and now as we're moving a little bit into evaluation as well. So the context for this work, if you can jump back to 3 years ago, almost to the day, you might recall an international news story that broke when there was an open letter that was published by the Future of Life Institute that was calling on a 6-month pause on giant AI experiments. At the time, this was a letter that was signed by around 1,000 individuals, some of the most prominent figures you can think of in technology, in academic research, focused on AI, in entrepreneurship. And as you might expect, this letter, if you don't recall the story, it prompted some folks to come forward and offer full-throated support. This is a great idea. And of course, there were also others that said, whoa, 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 whoa. We don't want to halt the technology's advancement, and of course, many, many opinions in between. Now, at the time, when this news story broke in the wake of, in this case, I think it was GPT-4 had been launched, which is what prompted the publication of this letter. The first thing that came to mind for me was the central issue seemed to be one of time. That is, the speed with which AI technologies were being developed and deployed was outpacing the amount of time that we had for public deliberation on the question of how to do so, how to roll it out, and how to regulate it. Now, I am not a computer scientist. I'm not a policymaker. I'm an applied theater practitioner. And by that I mean I'm somebody who brings people together and invites them to share stories and to engage in improv exercises and to create scenes that one way or another illuminate their own lived experience. That could be their values, different things that they've experienced in their lives, and the whole idea is that these are an entree into deeper conversations around issues of public concern. So I got to thinking, since applied theater methods can be really effective at slowing things down and making space for us to articulate our lived experiences and perhaps more importantly, hear others, maybe there could be something to this in terms of trying to address this particular issue that, of course, is on many people's minds and is prompting conversation globally. So this led to me going, well, I need to learn a lot more about AI ethics to begin with. And so as I searched, I, of course, learned about Hoda's really wonderful work in AI ethics education here at Virginia Tech and beyond. And she was gracious enough to let me come into her machine learning class and sit in and ask really naive questions and engage with her students. And after those visits, some conversation about both what you were seeing among students and were interested in, and what I knew of some of the strengths of applied theater methods relative to this issue led us to want to start a collaboration. So that being said, I'd love to, Hoda, invite you to speak a little bit about AI ethics education.
Thank you. So before joining academia, I worked in the industry for 7 years after earning my PhD, and I delivered AI systems to different clients, government and commercial. I was not trained as part of my PhD education on anything related to implications beyond solving the problem. So the engineering scientist approach when we're given a problem is to just break it down into how am I going to solve it? And as soon as I solve it, check, I'm done, right? This is success. And thinking beyond this, thinking beyond delivering a solution and what the implications are, since I haven't been trained to do that, it was completely up to me and up to my experience and my knowledge and my values. And so I wanted to make sure that when I train students and teach them about AI, I think about their future as AI practitioners, AI system designers, and I want to raise awareness and educate them about these implications and these ethical values. And it's not enough to just say, hey, make sure your algorithm is not biased, make sure your algorithm is trustworthy or explainable or interpretable, but to explain to them what that means when it comes to like algorithmic practices. So this is kind of how this motivated this project. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So as we designed this project, we first started with a couple of research questions. One was how, to what extent, could applied theater methods be employed to foster the kind of education and dialogue and understanding on AI ethics as a particular issue? And secondarily, a much more focused look on how could it contribute to computer science students' capacities for skill building in collaboration, recognizing that these choices are ones that are being require deliberation beyond single individuals to rather what are our aspirations more collectively for responsible use and deployment of this technology. So we designed a pilot that would be a series of applied theater workshops with this as the focus, AI ethics. And within those, we had a set of objectives that we decided we wanted to embark on. One was to help students recognize that design choices are reflective of values they might hold, and those values might shift depending on context. We also, of course, wanted to help the students engage in respectful dialogue with one another, recognizing that there would likely be divergent opinions among the students we were working with about what appropriate use of AI might be or appropriate levels of regulation and so on. We also wanted to help them, and this is something theater or more broadly art making is really good at, helping them envision possibilities of the future, right? How could particular AI design choices or regulations manifest different futures, right? What could be the benefits? What could be the drawbacks? What are the trade-offs we need to consider therein? Additionally, we wanted to help students recognize that they have agency in how AI may be designed and regulated in the future. I know sometimes this is such a grand enterprise internationally, and I can imagine it might be challenging for some students to see what role they as individuals might play in that. We thought that participation in this series of exercises would help them recognize that their voice truly matters as this technology continues to develop. And lastly, this is sort of the broader mission. In our own small way, we were hoping that engaging in these kinds of techniques might help to foster a greater culture of ethics-informed decision-making among these students, something that Hoda had been doing for a while to begin with, and this would just represent sort of a host of new techniques aiming to do so. That led us to the design of this project. So ICAT generously supported, through their mini seed grant program, the launch of this project. And we started just a couple months ago in February. Over the past several months, we've hosted 5 workshops of varying scales, anywhere from as few as 5 students up to 40, 45 students at a time. These workshops are anywhere from an hour to 3 hours in length, and we've had 64 participants so far. And I say in counting because we're really midstream at this point. I think we have 4 or 5 more workshops lined up between now and the end of the semester. Some of the methods that we've employed in these workshops have been facilitated dialogues where Hoda and I identify a series of questions or considerations that we want students to engage with to begin with. We also engage in all kinds of improv exercises that are focused on students cultivating their listening skills, their ability to discern others' kind of emotional conditions or values, interests, also just gaining some facility and spontaneity and engaging with alternative viewpoints. We also have hosted a series of story circles. This is where we identify a theme that is salient to AI ethics. We present that theme to the students and invite them to share personal stories they have that in some way connect with that theme. Some of the other techniques that we've used are sociometry. Some of you might have participated in an exercise like this before. It comes by different names. One is thinking on your feet, or a foot poll, where participants are presented with a statement or a question and asked to stand on the floor. Imagine there's sort of a continuum on the floor, and they stand on the floor relative to what their opinion might be on a subject. The idea being that no position is neutral. You have to choose somewhere in the room to stand, and then that becomes the basis for a conversation about, okay, why did you choose to stand where you're standing? What would compel you to move? You know, where does the majority of the room aggregating, and where do we see some outlier viewpoints? The 2 other techniques that we've used that you'll learn a little bit more about later in this presentation are image theater and forum theater. These are methodologies that were developed by a theater maker known as Augusto Boal from Brazil in the 70s and mid-80s. Image theater is a technique that rather than asking people to engage purely verbally about their viewpoints, invites people to do so through their bodies. So what that looks like is people are presented with ideas, concepts, questions, stories, and asked to literally put their bodies in different positions, molding themselves or other people to create little tableaux. These might be abstract. These might be really literal and representative, but one way or another, it provides another means of communication, recognizing that we can get pretty far with verbal communication, but there are also limitations. It especially becomes effective if you're working across linguistic differences too, because it just provides another way in where you can analyze the images that people create and what's underlying those images. Forum theater as a technique is one that's designed to dramatize dilemmas that a community might have, and through the roles of a protagonist who's aiming to resolve that dilemma and an antagonist who represents its opposition, that you actually start to brainstorm as a community different ways of strategizing around a community issue. So without going into a really long theater history diatribe, I'll say that historically theater has been something where you have folks on a stage, in this case, and then you have spectators. Augusto Boal, through forum theater, suggested that maybe spectators should rather be spect-actors. That is, individuals with agency who, beyond sitting quietly and sort of clapping at the end of a presentation, actually can step into the action, into the role of the protagonist, and try out alternative scenarios to resolve a particular issue. I'll share a story about one scene that was developed later to give that a little bit more detail. Lastly, I'll say the data collection methods we've employed. We've been asking participants to complete intake and ultimately exit surveys as well to gauge what are you learning and how, if at all, are your participation in these exercises changing your attitudes about certain AI design or regulation choices. We're also taking tons of field notes in these sessions. As you might imagine, there's a lot of conversation, a lot of different forms of data coming forward, and so afterwards we furiously scribble down everything we can remember in terms of what people shared, what they showed, what they asked about. And then lastly, once the project concludes, we're going to be conducting some qualitative interviews, more in-depth conversations with the participants to get a sense of how, if at all, their participation in this project expanded their thinking or knowledge about AI, or shifted their opinions with regard to ethical design or policy choices. All right, I'll just share a couple of quick examples of snapshots from some of these sessions. So in this first, maybe a good place to start would be to talk about what are the AI ethics principles that have undergirded this work, or what's sort of our point of departure in engaging students with this subject. And Hoda, do you want to speak a little bit about those principles that have been the basis?
Sure. So we have trustworthiness. So basically, it's really important for people when they use an AI system to be able to trust the output or the recommendation made by that system. And in order for this to happen, one other important principle is transparency. So being able to understand how the system makes this decision or generate this conclusion is really also important. And then making sure it does not cause harm. And what else do we have here? Autonomy. And so privacy, of course, is clear, I guess. And when it comes to autonomy, it's really important for someone to have the choice to be able to influence how this system is making their decision for them. Did I cover all of them? Oh, and equity and justice. Yep. So.
Great, thank you, Hoda. Yeah, so these concepts, they're elemental, and yet they're also something that, when I say transparency, the image I have in my mind might be very different than your image. And so we thought applied theater methods, specifically image theater, might be a way of revealing the assumptions or the associations people have with these concepts that are so fundamental to how we design AI, and yet perhaps unquestioned, or at least not questioned in this way. So what you see here are two very quick snapshots. One in the top left corner where you see the two people screaming and the person kind of listening in surreptitiously. That's privacy, or at least this group of students' depiction of privacy as they understand it. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, we see an image these students created of trustworthiness. So you see this kind of outward, official, open, congenial engagement, right? But also separations between the bodies. So the details that are in these images, how a person holds their body, what seems to be their emotional affect, all become points of conversation, right? What does this reflect? What's missing? The next example I'll share is one of forum theater. So I talked a little bit about this before kind of conceptually. And in this circumstance, we had some students and two faculty members, including our very own Hoda here, who developed a scene in the span of 10, 15 minutes that dramatized a use case that they were interested in. In this case, the circumstance was we had in this scenario, we had a design professor who assigned to a student, okay, I want you to work on this design project, bring it back in a week, you'll grade it, and so on. Well, the student, not fully understanding what the project entailed, decided to use, in this scene, an AI model to assist them, right? And so they were at the computer. And in this case, we had actors play the AI models. So bottom left-hand corner, she was a, yeah. Oh, an AI model, yes. So the student had this AI model, and they go to they input the rubric and the assignment details. And they say, spit out such and such as a design, and they bring it back to the professor. The professor accepts the assignment, and in turn, privately, submits the student's work to their own AI model, in this case, as a way of evaluating how close did the student get to this. Well, this was not information that the professor disclosed to the student. And yet, when the student's work was run through the AI model in the scenario, lo and behold, the AI detection software says, ding, 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 this is generated by AI. The student gets a bad grade, a D- in this case, and the way the scenario played out, this was a capstone project, so the stakes were really high for the student. And then when they came back together again, it prompted this much deeper conversation or analysis about just some of the issues embedded in this one person-to-person interaction. So things like originality. What does it mean to have creative voice when you have access to these technologies? Laziness was something. One of the participants said that both characters, they described them as lazy, which has its own sort of set of assumptions and questions embedded in it. It also prompted conversation about disclosure, cultural bias in training data and outputs, the idea being that the student's work reflected, in this case, a westernized viewpoint predominantly because those were the kinds of the data that was in the model to begin with. It also prompted questions around the clarity of assignments, instructional supports that students may or may not have, accessibility and accommodations. This one little 5 to 10 minute scene prompted a lot of engagement. And I think importantly, it got us beyond simply intellectualizing about the subject to what does it mean to be in an interaction where some of these AI ethics issues are playing out in real time. You know, how do you operate in that space to advocate for a particular viewpoint? Which are the kind of skills that we want students who are going to be designing these models or producing policy associated with the models, we want them to be equipped to do effectively. Some of our preliminary findings, I say preliminary because like I said, we're midstream in the project, are as such. One, as you might imagine, despite unfair characterizations of some students as embracing AI for any and every project, as you might imagine, there's a really wide range in viewpoints we've heard among students. Some who certainly support and engage with AI, some that are very wary of it, and lots of viewpoints in between. Those viewpoints also are very context dependent, which theater has been really effective at opening up. You can sort of change the scenario and it might change what people's determinations are as to what it feels appropriate or inappropriate. Trust has been a major issue that's come forward, not just the trustworthiness of the models themselves in terms of the accuracy of what they put out, but when AI is now introduced into the ecosystems of academia or healthcare or what have you, how does that strengthen or jeopardize trust between individuals? Some students have expressed concern around privacy, namely, where's my data going, how's it being used? Fairness, labor, productivity, and academic integrity have been a big issue also. You know, students saying, I sort of feel like whether I use AI or I don't use AI, I'm kind of in a bind in either direction with regard to my work being assessed. I mentioned this before, but questions around human creativity are really central to a lot of the students' conversations. We had one student who was remarking, like, I really want to develop a strong authorial voice, and I'm just learning how to write. And to what extent is AI supporting that or jeopardizing my opportunity to develop a voice that feels true to me? Agency and autonomy has come up as a major topic of interest among the students too, namely this question of, as AI becomes progressively more ubiquitous, you know, it's everywhere we're going, how much agency do I have to choose not to use it or to use it? Regulation is something that students have identified as, they have different views on depending on what scale we're talking about. So for instance, a lot of the students have said they feel comfortable with AI policy at Virginia Tech as it exists presently, but as we think outward to state level, certainly federal and even international, as we think about NGOs and things like that, that there much more work needs to be done in terms of specifying how these things should be used and deployed. And lastly, I'll just highlight that there are some complicated questions that students have raised about their own kind of connection with AI models as companions, or in some cases even therapists. So for instance, I had a particular student who was talking about, you know, I have used AI for therapeutic purposes, and it's been great insofar that it's accessible. I don't have to pay for it. I don't have to make an appointment. My healthcare doesn't cover it. But at the same time, that students raised concerns about, like, what does that mean for the possibility for human connection, which is ultimately the goal for mental health. The last few findings I'll highlight here before we wrap up and transition to questions are how the applied theater methods work. We found that if we move from generality to specificity, it's been much more effective, right? Talking about transparency writ large or even healthcare writ large isn't particularly helpful. But as we drill down to specific use cases, the conversation is much more generative. The use cases themselves really need to be relevant to the participants. So as you might imagine, a lot of them have focused on what's happening here in higher ed. Storytelling is a great way into personalizing some of these issues. Embodiment, as I said earlier, that is depicting a concept physically as opposed to just intellectualizing or talking about it, provides just like kind of a window into additional facets of what people understand these principles to be. And lastly, I'll just highlight that a lot of the students' attitudes have been maintained, not everybody, but most of them have reported like, the way I felt about AI is pretty similar going into and coming out of this, but uniformly, participants have said that they've gained a lot of knowledge from one another through the participation in these workshops. We can speak a little bit about this maybe in the Q&A, but I want to be respectful of time. I've got a Post-it note here that says 923 in bold letters, and so I want to respect the Post-it note. At this time, I'd love to invite, if you have any questions for Hoda and I, we're happy to answer them.
I expect there will be questions.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. That was a really great presentation. So I'm an engineer by training, and I loved your comment, Hoda, about your you fix the problem, solve the problem, but you don't think about what happens when it's used and what happens next. And so one of the things I'd like to hear what your thoughts on is this idea of how this process connects emotion and knowledge and memory. So if I solved something as an engineer and had a really interesting ethical consideration in that process, but then I walked out into practice and everyone around me is saying, just solve the problem and get on with your life, kind of thing, get on with the profession. You're kind of running against the current of the experience that engineers are in, right? So I guess my question is how does putting somebody in a place where they might have an emotional connection to what they're doing allow them to remember this kind of really important ethical consideration, so when they're out in life and trying to survive as an engineer, for example, they can go back and say, I must remember this really important dimension that I have to implement from now on. Does that make sense? Like this emotional connection, I think is maybe, so in your post interviews, I'm wondering, how does emotion appear, and does it connect with knowledge and a new way of thinking?
Yeah. Do you want to take that?
I'll try. So part of teaching engineering students about like engineering design of systems, perhaps, a very critical component that we fundamentally stress on is assumptions, right? So what are the assumptions when you're making that design? And then when you take this system and you go and deploy, what is the context? Has the context changed, right? Sometimes we say, all right, this model is going to perform in that particular manner, given that the data looks like this, and the input and output has these characteristics. If these assumptions are violated, there's no guarantee that the model will perform that way. So this is kind of like the engineering way of defining what the assumptions are, and we train our students to think about it that way. But then generalizing this concept of assumptions to comparing and contrasting what I intended for my system to do versus how the system is being used, and has that changed, right? And I feel like just raising that awareness of people thinking about how is it going to be deployed is really important. And the more that they can think about this, I think there could be that emotion tie, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for the question, Ralph. One thing I'll add in addition to what Hoda said too is the value of story, among other things. Story has been shown to help people not only cultivate a better understanding of information they're taking in, but also to retain it. And so by using story, we, one, create a space where people can learn more and hopefully hold on to that knowledge that they learn from others, which ideally they would carry into their work at an engineering firm, for instance, or an AI developer. And I think secondly, the process, setting aside the question of what the story is, the process of being asked to tell a personal story that in some way connects with, let's say, an instance in which you encountered an AI ethics issue in your work. It creates a space for kind of self-clarification, right? I mean, if I ask that question myself, I go, okay, what are the instances in my life in which I've encountered this? Why do I encounter it? And then when individuals can ask questions from the outside about, okay, when you encountered that, what were you thinking? What were you feeling? It creates this space for people to start to empathize with one another and to ideally have their worldview expanded. So as these design choices are made, as Hoda said, they can sort of preemptively be testing these assumptions they might be carrying through story. Does that answer your question? Okay, thanks. Other questions?
Hoda, I have a question for you. Because you were already teaching this, Is it your hope that you would be able to implement this kind of work based on, I mean, once you get done seeing what the results are, implement this kind of work in your courses? Or maybe my question is, what kinds of differences are you seeing in how students engage with the material, the way you were teaching versus these workshops?
Thank you for this question. Actually, I joined Virginia Tech in fall 2019, and I've been teaching machine learning courses throughout. And from day one, I made sure to always include an ethics/policy module in my teaching towards the end, being like, all right, having learned about this, imagine you're now graduating and having this job. Let's think about the implications. Let's talk about your final project, break it down, and then reflect on these concepts. So this semester, John and I actually launched a mini workshop in my class. We're going to have a second one, and I'm very grateful for this project because it is really connecting those emotions with these concepts that are typically abstract and dry, right? It's making it more tangible, and I was very happy to see the students really connect with these kind of activities. So yes, we are. We're very excited about it. Thank you.
All right, well, we are at time. So I invite you to continue the conversations. I know that John and Hoda will be here for a few minutes afterwards, I hope. And please enjoy pastries and coffee and tea and all the things. Thank you so much for being here this morning. I hope you have a fabulous weekend. And we'll be back here next week with another great idea and more pastries and coffee. So see you then.